Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Lamer Summer, and my capstone project is called the Invisible Loss Mapping Method. Today, I'd like to share not only what I created, but also how I got there. So rather than simply walking you through a literature review and then showing you the finished product, I'd like to take you on a journey from my research to practice and show you how the literature shaped every part of the guidebook I created. So, why this project? Well, my project actually began with my own experience. Years ago, I experienced infertility, and while I wasn't grieving the death of a person, I was grieving the loss of the future I had imagined. And what surprised me the most was how invisible that grief really felt. What made it especially difficult, though, was that no one really seemed to see it as a real loss. It was hard to grieve something that other people didn't recognize as something to grieve. And over time, I realized I wasn't just grieving the loss itself, I was grieving the identity I thought I would have as a mother. That experience led me to a much broader realization, and that is some of the most life changing losses people experience don't actually involve death at all. Whether it's infertility, divorce, chronic illness, estrangement, job loss, or other major life changes, these experiences can profoundly affect a person's sense of identity, and yet they often go unrecognized. I wanted to understand why these experiences can change us so profoundly and what actually helps people rebuild their sense of self afterward. And that's what led me to the literature and ultimately became the foundation of this project. As I started reading the literature, I realized that my experience wasn't unique, and researchers like Pauline Boss and Kenneth Doika had been describing these kinds of losses for years. One of the biggest things I learned was that non death loss is real, even if other people don't always see it that way. Whether, like we said, it's infertility, divorce, chronic illness, estrangement, or any other major life change, people are often grieving something that's invisible to everybody else. Boss's work on ambiguous loss and Doika's work on disenfranchised grief helped me understand why these experiences can feel so isolating. When a loss isn't recognized by others, people are often left wondering if they're even allowed to grieve it. That helped me realize the problem wasn't just the loss itself. It was that so many people were carrying these losses without feeling seen or even understood. As I read more, I was surprised how often the literature came back to one idea: meaning making. Researchers like Robert Niemeyer, Crystal Park, and Paul Wong all described it as an essential part of adapting to loss. What I found especially interesting was that the research wasn't really about helping people get over a loss. Instead, it described healing as making sense of what had happened and then finding a way to weave that experience into the story of your life. One of the biggest things I realized was that meaning isn't something another person can give you. No one can tell you what your loss should mean. It's something that each person has to discover through reflection, exploring their experiences, and making sense of what life looks like now. That right there really changed the way I thought about my project. If meaning can't be given to someone, then whatever I created couldn't be about giving people answers. It needed to help people discover them on their own. As I kept reading, I noticed another theme beginning to connect the literature. Once again, we have researchers like Robert Niemeyer, Dan McAdams, and James Gillies. They're all describing how significant loss can change the way people see themselves and their future. So, what struck me was that the researchers weren't just describing grief, it was describing a disruption in identity. People weren't only grieving what had happened, they were also grieving the person they thought they were going to be and the future they had imagined. That was another turning point for me. I realized my project wasn't really about grief alone. It was about helping people rebuild their sense of identity after non death loss. So, identity reconstruction became the thread that connected everything I had been reading. Once I realized my project was really about identity reconstruction, I had another decision to make. What kind of approach would best support that process? As I explored the coaching literature, researchers like Anthony Grant and the coactive coaching model by Kimsey House and colleagues, that helped me to see why coaching was such a good fit. Coaching isn't about telling people what to do or who they should become. It's about asking thoughtful questions, encouraging reflection, and helping people discover their own answers. That really resonated with me because it fit everything I had already learned. If meaning has to be discovered and identity has to be rebuilt, then I didn't want to create a program that gave people answers. I wanted to create one that helped them find their own. And yet there was a piece missing. Because as I thought about my own experience, I kept coming back to how isolating non-death loss could feel. As so many people are carrying invisible losses or non-death losses, I started wondering whether healing might be easier if they didn't have to carry them alone. And that led me to the literature on group support. So researchers like Irvin Yalom, Molen Legitz, they described how groups create a sense of universality. This is the realization that you're not the only one who's ever felt this way. And that really resonated with me because isolation, it is one of the hardest parts of non-death loss. The research also showed that people don't just learn from a facilitator. They learn from hearing one another's stories, offering support, and seeing pieces of themselves reflected in someone else's experience. And that's when I realized this project shouldn't just be a coaching program. It should be a group coaching program where people could then discover meaning for themselves, but while also realizing they weren't alone. As I stepped back and looked at everything I'd been reading, something finally clicked. I wasn't looking at 5 separate topics anymore. I was looking really at one journey for someone in having non-death loss. So, people experience a significant non-death loss. That loss can disrupt their sense of identity. Through meaning-making coaching and connection with others, they begin to rebuild their sense of self. And that's when I realized I wasn't just reviewing the literature anymore. I was starting to see the foundation of the program I wanted to create. As everything started coming together, I found myself asking one last question. If I wanted people to actually experience everything I'd learned from the literature, what would that look like? The answer became the invisible loss mapping method. I didn't want to create a guidebook that simply gave people information about grief. I wanted to create something people would actually have an experience with, a guidebook that would help them reflect, discover meaning, connect with others, and begin rebuilding their sense of self. This first example is the Invisible Loss collage, which participants create during the very first session. Rather than beginning with words, the collage invites them to explore their experience through images, colors, and symbols, making invisible loss visible in a very personal way. It is followed by a reflection page where participants begin putting meaning to what they created and identifying the insights that emerged from the activity. The takeaway page that appears on the left side of the screen, these appear at the end of each session, and they invite participants to pause and reflect on what they're taking with them before moving forward, whether that's a new insight, a shift in perspective, or a renewed sense of hope. And then throughout the guidebook, participants also encounter what I call illumination moments. These offer creative ways to reflect through activities beyond traditional journaling. Together, these features recognize that people process experiences differently while encouraging ongoing meaning-making and personal growth. As I look back on this project, I realize I created more than a guidebook. I created something I wish had existed when I was trying to make sense of my own invisible loss. So what started as a personal question became a journey through the literature. And along the way, I discovered that healing isn't just about grieving what's been lost. It's about rebuilding a sense of who we are. My hope is that my invisible loss mapping method gives people a place to feel seen, to reflect, to connect with others, and to begin moving forward in a way that feels meaningful to them. Thank you.